Sometimes, the loudest thing in the world isn't a scream, it's a mother trying not to break. The cry cut through the dim airplane cabin like a sharp thread pulled too tight, thin at first, then unraveling into something impossible to ignore as heads turned one by one, eyes flickering open in irritation, glowing phone screens lighting up tired faces while the steady hum of the engines couldn't drown it out, and in seat 32B, Emily Carter tightened her arms around her 6-month-old daughter, her fingers trembling just enough to betray how exhausted she truly was as she whispered softly. "Hey, it's okay, sweetheart, Mommy's here," her voice barely louder than the recycled air moving through the vents above, but the baby's cries only grew, small fists curling against her chest as if fighting a world that had already asked too much of her, and Emily swallowed hard, blinking against the sting behind her eyes because she could feel it now, that shift in the air, the quiet judgment that didn't need words. The man across the aisle sighing too loudly, the woman 2 rows ahead. Adjusting her sleep mask with a sharp tug, the flight attendant pausing just long enough to assess whether this was becoming a situation, and Emily lowered her gaze, not in shame but in practiced endurance, because she had been here before, in grocery lines, in waiting rooms, in every place where patience wore thin faster than compassion, and she leaned her forehead gently against her baby's soft hair, inhaling that faint powdery scent that reminded her why she kept going even when everything else felt like it was slipping. "Shoo, it's okay, we're okay," she murmured again, but this time the words shifted, softer, unfamiliar to most ears around her as she repeated them in Spanish, the rhythm changing, lilting, then again in French, her tone like a quiet melody threading through the tension, then German, precise and steady, then Italian, warm and flowing, each language carrying the same message wrapped in a different sound, a different comfort, as if she was searching for the one that would reach her daughter through the noise, and one by one, the sharp edges in the cabin began to dull, not because the crying had stopped, but because something else had taken its place, something unexpected, a kind of quiet that wasn't forced but drawn in. And a few rows ahead, Daniel Whitmore, seated where space was measured in comfort instead of inches, lifted his eyes from the document in his hand, his attention caught not by the disruption but by the pattern, the deliberate shift in tone, the way her voice never rose, never cracked, just adapted, again and again, and he watched, not with annoyance, not with curiosity alone, but with something deeper, something that had been absent from his world for longer than he cared to admit, because while others saw inconvenience, he saw effort, relentless and unrecognized, and when Emily finally paused, her voice barely a breath now as she tried one more time, whispering in a 7th language, softer than all the rest, the baby's cries faltered, just for a second, just enough to feel like hope, and in that fragile silence, Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, as if he had just witnessed something the rest of the cabin wasn't equipped to understand, something quiet, something rare. Something that couldn't be bought, only recognized. The baby's cries softened into uneven breaths, small hiccups lingering in the quiet that followed, and Emily Carter did not move right away, as if she was afraid that even the slightest shift might break whatever fragile calm she had managed to build, her hand resting gently on her daughter's back, tracing slow circles that matched the rhythm of her own breathing while the tension that had filled the cabin moments ago now hovered in an uncertain stillness, passengers glancing at each other without quite knowing why the irritation had faded, and Emily exhaled carefully, her shoulders lowering for the first time since boarding, though the exhaustion in her eyes remained deep and familiar, like something she had been carrying for far longer than this flight, and she leaned back just slightly against the thin seat, closing her eyes for a second that felt dangerously close to surrender before forcing them open again because she could not afford to drift, not here, not now, not when. Every moment demanded her attention, and across the aisle a man cleared his throat, softer this time, almost hesitant, as if reconsidering the impatience he had shown earlier, while the flight attendant who had paused before now offered a small, restrained smile before continuing down the aisle, and it was subtle, almost invisible, but something had shifted, something unspoken that no announcement could have created, and a few rows ahead, Daniel Whitmore watched it all unfold with a quiet focus, his gaze not lingering on the baby, not even on the surrounding passengers, but on Emily herself, on the way she held her composure without expecting acknowledgement, on the way she absorbed discomfort without returning it, and there was a precision to her restraint that caught his attention more than any display of emotion ever could, because it was not weakness, it was control shaped by necessity, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the armrest, his expression unreadable but intent, as if calculating something beyond numbers or outcomes, something human, something he had learned to overlook in rooms filled with polished voices and rehearsed confidence, and for a moment he considered looking away, returning to the world he understood, where problems were solved with decisions and distance, but instead he remained, his eyes following the quiet aftermath rather than the noise that had preceded it, and Emily adjusted the small blanket around her daughter, tucking it gently beneath her chin, her fingers careful, practiced, as if each movement had been repeated 100 times in different places under different pressures, and she glanced briefly toward the window, the darkness outside stretching endlessly beyond the glass, offering no reflection, no distraction, just a reminder of how far she still had to go, and in that glance there was something else, something fleeting, a question she did not ask out loud, whether she would make it through the rest of this journey the same way she had made it through everything else, quietly, without asking for help, without expecting anything in return, and Daniel saw it, not because it was obvious, but because he had spent years recognizing what people chose not to say, and this time, for reasons he could not immediately explain, he did not dismiss it. The cabin settled into a low, steady quiet, the kind that felt fragile, like it could crack at any moment if someone spoke too loudly or shifted too abruptly, and Emily Carter kept her movements small, almost careful to the point of invisibility, adjusting the edge of her daughter's blanket with slow precision while her eyes stayed half-focused on nothing in particular, not quite resting, not quite alert, as if her body no longer trusted stillness to last, and she reached into the worn diaper bag at her feet, her fingers brushing against neatly folded items that had been packed with intention, each one counted, each one necessary, until she found the small bottle she had prepared hours earlier, checking it instinctively before bringing it closer, testing the temperature against her wrist the way she always did, even though she already knew it would be right, because routine was the only thing that made uncertainty manageable, and as she lifted the bottle to her daughter's lips, the baby stirred, then settled, tiny hands loosening their grip as the tension drained from her small frame, and Emily allowed herself a breath she had been holding for what felt like the entire flight, her shoulders softening as she leaned back just enough to support both of them without shifting the balance she had carefully maintained, and around her, the cabin resumed its quiet rhythm, seatbelt signs glowing faintly, overhead vents humming, the distant clink of a beverage cart somewhere further up the aisle, and yet something remained different, not visible, not spoken, but present in the way no one seemed eager to complain anymore, as if the moment had left behind a trace of something difficult to name, and Daniel Whitmore noticed it, not as a change in the room, but as a continuation of what he had already begun to understand, because he had seen people command attention with volume, with authority, with presence that demanded recognition, but this was something else entirely, something that did not ask to be seen and yet could not be ignored once it was, and he shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze still steady, not intrusive, not obvious, but deliberate, and for a brief second, Emily looked up, her eyes scanning the space ahead of her without focus until they brushed past his, and in that instant there was no recognition, no expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement that someone had witnessed her without adding weight to it, and she looked away just as quickly, returning to the small, contained world in her arms, unaware of the decision forming just a few rows ahead, a decision that had nothing to do with convenience or courtesy and everything to do with something Daniel had not felt in a long time, a clarity that did not come from logic but from instinct, and he reached up, pressing the small call button above his seat with a calm that did not draw attention, the soft chime barely audible over the hum of the engines, and when the flight attendant approached, her posture professional, her voice lowered to match the quiet of the cabin, he leaned slightly toward her, speaking in a tone so even it carried no sense of urgency, yet left no room for hesitation, his words simple, measured, and impossible to misinterpret as he made a request that would quietly alter the course of someone else's journey without ever needing to explain why. The flight attendant paused for a fraction of a second, not because she did not understand, but because requests like this were rare in their simplicity and unmistakable in their intent, and she nodded once, her professional composure masking the quiet surprise that flickered behind her eyes as she glanced briefly toward the back of the cabin where Emily Carter sat, still cradling her daughter with the same careful stillness, unaware that anything beyond her immediate world was shifting, and the attendant leaned slightly closer to Daniel Whitmore, her voice lowered even further as she confirmed the seat availability, her tone respectful but measured, as if she already sensed that this was not a casual upgrade or a spontaneous indulgence, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, not seeking acknowledgement, not offering explanation, just allowing the moment to unfold with the same quiet control that defined everything he did, and within seconds, the attendant straightened, smoothing her uniform before turning down the aisle, her steps light but purposeful as she made her way toward row 32, weaving past passengers who barely noticed her passing, their attention returned to screens and half-finished conversations, unaware that something meaningful was about to occur just a few feet away, and when she reached Emily, she slowed, her posture softening, her voice gentle in a way that stood in contrast to the earlier tension. "Ma'am," she said quietly, careful not to startle her, "would you mind coming with me for a moment?" And Emily looked up, confusion flickering across her face as her first instinct was concern, her eyes dropping briefly to her daughter as if to check whether she had done something wrong, whether the calm she had worked so hard to create was somehow not enough, and she shifted slightly in her seat, her grip tightening just a little as she responded, her voice low, "Is everything okay?" And the attendant offered a reassuring smile, the kind that carried warmth without revealing too much. "Everything is fine, we would just like to make your flight a little more comfortable," and for a moment, Emily did not move, not because she did not hear, but because she did not immediately believe it, her mind searching for the part of the sentence that she might have misunderstood, because comfort was not something she had learned to expect, especially not in situations like this, and she glanced around briefly, as if the explanation might be written somewhere in the reactions of others, but the cabin remained unchanged, no one watching, no one reacting, and slowly, cautiously, she nodded, gathering the small blanket more securely around her daughter before rising carefully from her seat, balancing her weight with practiced ease, her movements deliberate as she reached for the worn bag at her feet, slinging it over her shoulder without disturbing the child in her arms, and as she stepped into the aisle, a few nearby passengers looked up, curiosity replacing the earlier irritation, their expressions shifting into something quieter, something less certain, as if they were witnessing a moment they could not quite define, and Emily followed the attendant forward, each step carrying her away from the narrow rows that had held her tension and into a space she had not expected to enter, her heart beating just a little faster, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar feeling of something changing without her having to fight for it. And a few rows ahead, Daniel Whitmore remained still, his gaze no longer fixed on her but directed forward, as if the outcome no longer required his attention, yet the subtle shift in his posture suggested otherwise. A quiet awareness that the decision he had made had already begun to reshape more than just a seat assignment. The transition into the front cabin felt almost unreal, not because of the space itself but because of how quietly it happened, no announcement, no spectacle, just a subtle shift in air and light as Emily Carter stepped past the curtain, her eyes adjusting to the softer glow, the wider seats, the absence of tension that had filled the rows behind her, and for a moment she hesitated, as if unsure whether she truly belonged there, her grip tightening slightly around her daughter while the flight attendant guided her with a gentle gesture toward an empty seat near the window. "You can sit here," she said softly, her tone steady, offering no explanation beyond the kindness in her voice, and Emily nodded, still processing, carefully lowering herself into the seat with a precision born from habit, ensuring the baby remained undisturbed, and as she settled in, the difference became unmistakable, the extra room allowing her to breathe more freely, the quiet surrounding her no longer filled with judgment but with a calm that did not demand anything from her, and she exhaled slowly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether this comfort was temporary or real, and her daughter shifted slightly in her arms before relaxing again, her small face soft, peaceful in a way that made Emily's chest tighten with something deeper than relief, something closer to disbelief, and she adjusted the blanket once more, smoothing it gently as her eyes moved around the cabin, taking in details she had only ever seen from a distance, the polished surfaces, the subtle movements of attendants who spoke in low, measured tones, the absence of restless energy, and yet beneath that observation, her thoughts circled back to the question she could not quite answer, why? Because nothing in her experience had prepared her for unasked kindness, not like this, not without condition, and she glanced briefly toward the aisle, half expecting someone to approach and correct the situation, to tell her there had been a mistake, but no one did, and the stillness remained intact, and a few seats away, Daniel Whitmore sat without turning, his posture composed, his attention seemingly directed elsewhere, yet the faint shift of his gaze suggested awareness, not of her reaction, but of the quiet that followed it. And Emily noticed him then, not fully, not with recognition, but as part of the environment, another passenger who did not stare, did not question, did not add weight to her presence, and there was something in that absence that allowed her shoulders to finally relax, just a little more, and she leaned back carefully, supporting her daughter with both arms, her eyes drifting closed for a brief second longer than before, not sleep, not quite, but rest in its simplest form, the kind that does not ask permission, and as the plane continued its steady course through the night sky, something subtle but undeniable settled into place, not just around her, but within her, a quiet shift from endurance to relief, from expectation of hardship to the possibility, however small, that for once, she did not have to carry everything alone, and she did not yet know who had made that possible, or why. But for the first time since boarding, that question did not feel urgent, because in this moment, what mattered was not the reason, but the rare, unfamiliar feeling of being seen without being judged, and being helped without having to ask. Time moved differently in the front cabin, not slower, not faster, just lighter, as if each second no longer carried the same weight it had before, and Emily Carter felt it in the way her breathing settled into a rhythm she had not noticed in days, her body gradually releasing the tension it had learned to hold without question, and she adjusted slightly in her seat, careful not to disturb her daughter who now rested fully against her, the steady rise and fall of the baby's chest a quiet reassurance that everything, at least for this moment, was okay, and Emily glanced down at her, her fingers brushing softly against the small curve of her cheek, memorizing the calm as if she might need to carry it with her later, because moments like this did not come often, not without effort, not without cost, and she leaned her head back, her eyes drifting toward the window where the darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint blinking of distant lights on the wing, and for a brief second, her thoughts wandered beyond the cabin, beyond the flight, to the life waiting on the other side, the bills, the uncertainty, the quiet calculations she made every single day just to keep going, and yet that weight felt distant now, not gone, but softened, like something temporarily set aside, and she exhaled slowly, her lips parting just enough to release a breath that carried more than exhaustion, something closer to gratitude, though she did not yet know where to place it, and a subtle movement nearby drew her attention as the flight attendant returned, this time with a small tray, her steps measured, her expression warm without intrusion. "Would you like some water, or anything else?" she asked gently, her voice matching the calm that filled the space, and Emily hesitated for just a moment, not out of refusal, but out of unfamiliarity, because being offered something without expectation still felt new, and she nodded, her voice soft. "Water would be great, thank you," and the attendant placed the glass carefully on the tray table beside her, ensuring it was within easy reach before stepping back with a quiet nod, and as Emily wrapped her fingers around the cool surface of the glass, she realized how dry her throat had been, how long it had been since she had taken a moment for herself, and she took a small sip, the simple act grounding her in a way she had not anticipated, and across the cabin, Daniel Whitmore remained composed, his posture unchanged, yet his attention had not fully drifted, his awareness still anchored to the shift he had set in motion, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet curiosity that lingered beneath his calm exterior, and he observed without staring, noticing the subtle ease in her shoulders, the way her movements had slowed, no longer dictated by urgency, and there was something in that transformation that held his focus, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, because it required no recognition to exist, and Emily, unaware of the source behind the moment she was experiencing, allowed herself to settle just a little deeper into the seat, her eyes closing once more, not from exhaustion alone, but from the rare permission to rest without needing to be on guard, and as the plane continued its steady path through the night, the distance between where she had been and where she now sat felt greater than just a few rows, it felt like a quiet crossing, one that did not erase her struggles, but reminded her, gently, that not every part of the world was as heavy as the one she had learned to endure. The quiet stretched deeper, settling into something that no longer felt temporary but gently earned, and Emily Carter remained still, her body finally allowing itself to exist without constant correction, her arms no longer bracing against tension but simply holding, supporting, resting, and she tilted her head slightly, watching her daughter sleep with a softness that carried both relief and something more fragile, something that only appeared when the world stopped pressing so hard, and for a moment, she let herself imagine what it would feel like if this calm could follow her beyond the cabin, into the days ahead where every decision carried weight and every dollar had a purpose, but the thought faded quickly, not out of pessimism, but out of habit, because hope was something she had learned to measure carefully, and she adjusted the blanket again, not because it needed fixing, but because the motion grounded her, gave her hands something to do in a moment that felt almost too still to trust, and nearby, a low murmur of conversation passed between two passengers, their voices calm, unaffected, as if the earlier tension had never existed, and that contrast did not go unnoticed by Daniel Whitmore, who sat with the same composed posture, his gaze directed forward, yet his awareness remained quietly anchored to the shift he had created, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in a way that observed outcome, because he had spent years making decisions that moved markets, influenced outcomes, reshaped environments, but those changes were loud, measurable, expected, while this was different, this was silent, immediate, and strangely personal, and he leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the armrest, considering not the act itself but the reason behind it, something that did not align with his usual patterns, and he glanced briefly toward Emily, not long enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm what he already sensed, that she had not turned the moment into something larger than it was, had not searched for him, had not tried to identify the source, she had simply accepted it with quiet caution and settled into it, and that detail held more weight than he expected, because it spoke of a kind of strength that did not seek validation, and Emily, unaware of his observation, shifted slightly, her eyes opening as her daughter made a small sound, not a cry, just a soft movement that signaled waking, and she responded instantly, her voice returning in a gentle whisper, this time in English, simple, warm, steady, hey, it is okay, I am right here, and the baby stirred, blinking slowly before relaxing again against her, and Emily smiled faintly, a small expression that carried more meaning than it showed, because it had been a long time since she had experienced a moment that did not require her to push through discomfort, and she reached for the glass of water again, taking another sip, her movements unhurried, her shoulders no longer tight with anticipation, and as she placed the glass back down, her gaze lifted briefly across the cabin, not searching, not expecting, just observing, and for a second, her eyes met Daniel's again, this time with a flicker of awareness, not recognition of who he was, but recognition that he had been present, that he had seen her before she moved, and there was no question in her expression, no assumption, just a quiet acknowledgement that passed between two people who understood something without needing to name it, and then she looked away, returning to her daughter, and the moment dissolved as quietly as it had formed, leaving behind something subtle yet lasting, a shift not in circumstance, but in perspective, as if, for the first time in a long while, the world had met her halfway instead of asking her to carry it alone. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight moved deeper into the night, a quiet signal that most passengers had surrendered to sleep or silence, and Emily Carter remained awake, not because she could not rest, but because part of her still held on to the unfamiliar comfort surrounding her, as if letting go too quickly might make it disappear, and she shifted gently, adjusting her position to ease the slight stiffness in her back, her daughter still resting peacefully against her, the soft warmth of the small body anchoring her in a way nothing else could, and she glanced once more around the cabin, her eyes tracing the subtle details she had only ever imagined from afar, the polished surfaces, the quiet efficiency, the absence of tension, and yet what stayed with her was not the luxury itself, but the feeling of being allowed to exist without scrutiny, and that realization lingered quietly, settling deeper than she expected, and she looked down at her daughter again, brushing a strand of fine hair away from her forehead, her touch light, deliberate, as if memorizing every calm breath, every peaceful second, because she knew how quickly moments like this could pass, and across the aisle, Daniel Whitmore shifted slightly in his seat, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. His gaze moving briefly toward the window before returning to the space ahead, his thoughts no longer tied to the usual calculations that filled his time, but instead circling something less defined, something he had not planned to engage with, and he exhaled slowly, his posture still composed, yet there was a subtle change in the way he held himself. As if the quiet interaction he had initiated had left an imprint he could not immediately categorize, and for a moment, he considered speaking, a simple acknowledgement, perhaps even a question, but the thought passed just as quickly as it came, not because he lacked the words, but because he understood that not every moment needed to be filled, and Emily, sensing movement without fully turning, glanced briefly in his direction again, her eyes meeting his for just a second longer this time, and there was a softness in her expression, not gratitude in the obvious sense, but something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if she understood that the shift in her circumstances had not been random, even if she did not know the source, and she offered a small nod, almost instinctive, not expecting a response, just acknowledging the presence of someone who had chosen not to look away, and Daniel responded in kind, a subtle inclination of his head, nothing more, nothing that would draw attention, yet enough to confirm that the moment had been shared. And then both of them returned to their separate stillness, the space between them filled not with distance, but with an understanding that did not require explanation, and as the plane continued its steady course through the quiet sky, the distance between strangers seemed smaller, not because of proximity, but because of a single choice made without noise, without expectation, a choice that had turned a moment of strain into something else entirely, something that neither of them would name, but both would remember long after the flight had ended. The quiet deepened into something almost sacred, the kind that made even the smallest movement feel meaningful, and Emily Carter found herself listening not just to the steady hum of the engines but to the subtle rhythm of her daughter's breathing, slow and even, each breath a quiet reassurance that the moment was holding, and she adjusted her hold slightly, easing the gentle weight in her arms without waking the child. Her movements instinctive, shaped by countless nights where rest had been something she negotiated rather than received, and she let her gaze drift again, not searching, just absorbing, allowing herself to notice the way the cabin seemed to carry a different kind of energy, one that did not press against her but seemed to give space instead, and it was unfamiliar enough to feel almost fragile, as if it might dissolve if she acknowledged it too directly, and she lowered her eyes again, focusing on the small details she could trust, the soft rise of her daughter's chest, the warmth against her own, the quiet presence of a moment that asked nothing more from her, and yet beneath that calm, a question lingered, not urgent, not sharp, but steady, because she knew something had changed, and changes, in her experience, always came with a reason, even if that reason was not immediately visible, and she thought briefly about asking, about turning slightly and seeking an answer in the only direction that felt possible, but the thought faded before it could take shape, not out of fear, but out of a quiet understanding that some things did not need to be explained to be real, and across the cabin, Daniel Whitmore remained still, his attention now turned outward toward the dark stretch beyond the window, though his thoughts were far from the horizon, circling instead the simplicity of what had just happened, the absence of negotiation, the lack of expectation, and the unusual sense that, for once, an action had not been tied to outcome or return, and that realization sat with him longer than he anticipated, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, as if it belonged to a part of his life he had not visited in years, and he shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the armrest, grounding himself in the present, in the quiet that had followed, and for a brief moment, his gaze moved again, not directly toward Emily, but enough to confirm that she had settled fully into the space, that the tension that had once surrounded her had not followed, and there was a quiet satisfaction in that, not pride, not ownership, just acknowledgement, and Emily, unaware of the full weight of the decision behind her, leaned her head back once more, her eyes closing for a few seconds longer this time, not resisting the rest as she might have before, and in that brief surrender, something within her softened, something that had been held tight for too long, and as the plane continued its steady path through the night, the distance between strangers, between lives that would likely never intersect again, felt less like separation and more like a quiet crossing, a moment where two different worlds had touched just enough to leave an imprint, not loud, not permanent, but real in a way that neither of them would easily forget. The hours passed quietly, measured not by announcements or interruptions but by the soft dimming and brightening of cabin lights, and Emily Carter woke slowly from a light, fragile rest, the kind that never fully let go but still managed to give something back, and for a second she did not move, her mind catching up with her body as she became aware of where she was, the unfamiliar space, the absence of tension, The steady warmth of her daughter still resting against her, and she exhaled gently. Careful not to disturb the small, peaceful moment that had carried her through the night, and she shifted slightly, adjusting her posture as a faint stiffness settled into her shoulders, the result of hours spent holding more than just weight, and she glanced toward the window, where the darkness had begun to soften into a distant gray, the first hint of morning stretching across the horizon, and something about that light felt different. Not just the start of a new day, but the quiet continuation of a moment she had not expected to experience at all, and she looked down at her daughter, brushing her fingers lightly along the edge of the blanket, grounding herself again in something real, something constant, and as she did, the subtle sounds of the cabin began to shift, a few passengers stirring, a quiet murmur returning as the world slowly reassembled itself after hours of stillness, and nearby, a flight attendant moved through the aisle with the same calm efficiency, offering soft greetings, preparing for the gradual return to routine, and Emily watched for a moment, taking it in without the urgency that usually accompanied movement, and then her gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the direction where she had last noticed him, and Daniel Whitmore sat as he had before, composed, present, yet somehow separate from the rhythm. Around him, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if the passage of time had not altered his awareness, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, this time in the quiet light of morning rather than the dim uncertainty of night, and there was something different in that exchange, something clearer, as if the moment between them had settled into something more defined, and Emily held his gaze just long enough to acknowledge it. A small, silent recognition that carried no questions. No expectations, just understanding, and she gave a slight nod, almost instinctive, her expression soft, and Daniel returned it with the same measured simplicity, a gesture that said nothing and yet confirmed everything that needed to be understood, and then the moment passed, not abruptly, but naturally, like something that had reached its full shape and no longer needed to grow, and Emily looked away, her attention returning to her daughter as she began to stir, small movements signaling the start of a new wakeful moment, and she leaned closer, her voice returning in a quiet whisper, steady, reassuring, "Good morning, sweetheart," and the words felt lighter than they had before, not because her life had changed, not because her challenges had disappeared, but because somewhere between the noise of yesterday and the calm of this morning, something within her had shifted, something subtle but lasting, a reminder that even in a world that often asked too much, there were still moments, however rare, where kindness appeared without being asked for, and those moments, though quiet, had the power to stay. The cabin gradually came alive with quiet activity, not rushed, not disruptive, but steady, as if the world was gently returning after allowing everyone a few borrowed hours of peace, and Emily Carter adjusted slightly in her seat, shifting her daughter into a more comfortable position as the baby began to wake fully, small movements turning into soft sounds, curious and alert rather than distressed. And Emily responded instantly, her voice warm, steady, carrying that same calm she had held through the night. "Hey there, did you sleep well?" she whispered, her tone light, almost playful, and the baby blinked up at her, eyes wide, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings without fear, and Emily smiled, a quiet, genuine expression that reached her eyes in a way that had not happened in a long time, and she brushed her fingers gently along her daughter's arm, grounding both of them in the moment, and around them, the cabin shifted further into wakefulness, seatbelts clicking softly, overhead bins opening with muted sounds, the low murmur of conversation returning in pieces, and a flight attendant approached once more, her posture composed, her expression carrying a subtle warmth that suggested she understood more than she would say. "We will be starting our descent in about 20 minutes. She said gently, her voice calm. "Please let me know if you need anything before we land," and Emily nodded, offering a small, appreciative smile, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you, for everything," and the attendant inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without elaboration, before moving on, and Emily watched her for a second before turning her attention back to her daughter, adjusting the blanket, checking the small bag at her side, instinctively preparing for what came next, because transitions had always required effort, always meant stepping back into a world that did not pause for her, and yet this time, something felt different, not easier, but steadier, as if the quiet support she had experienced had left behind something she could carry forward, and she took a slow breath, her gaze drifting once more across the cabin, and it found him again, Daniel Whitmore, still seated, still composed, yet somehow more present in the daylight, and for a moment, she considered speaking, just a simple thank you, something to close the space between what had happened and what would come next, but the thought lingered without becoming action, not because she lacked the courage, but because she understood that not every kindness needed to be named to be real, and instead, she met his eyes one last time, her expression clear, steady, offering something unspoken yet complete. A quiet acknowledgement that held gratitude without weight, and Daniel returned the look. With the same calm recognition, his nod slight but deliberate, as if confirming that nothing more was required, and then the plane began its slow descent. The subtle shift in motion felt more than heard, and Emily turned her attention fully back to her daughter, securing her gently, preparing for landing, her movements practiced, her focus steady, and as the ground slowly rose to meet them, the distance between the moment they had shared and the life waiting below did not feel like a loss, but like something carried forward, quiet, unseen, yet present in a way that would shape more than just this flight, something that would remain long after the wheels touched down. The wheels touched the runway with a soft, steady thud, followed by the long exhale of reverse thrust easing the aircraft into motion across the ground, and Emily Carter felt the shift not just beneath her seat but within herself, as if the quiet journey she had experienced was gently giving way to the reality waiting beyond the cabin doors, and she adjusted her hold on her daughter, securing her carefully as the plane slowed, her movements precise, familiar, grounded in the routine that had carried her through every transition before, yet there was something different in the way she moved now, something steadier, less burdened by the invisible weight she had carried when she first boarded, and as the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the cabin filled with the soft clicks of seatbelts unfastening, overhead bins opening, voices returning in low, scattered conversations, and Emily remained seated for a moment longer, not in hesitation, but in quiet awareness, allowing the moment to settle before stepping back into motion, and she glanced down at her daughter, who now looked around with curious eyes, alert and calm, her small hands reaching lightly at the edge of the blanket, and Emily smiled softly, brushing her fingers against the baby's hand, grounding herself in that connection before lifting her gaze once more across the cabin, and it found him again, Daniel Whitmore, now standing, retrieving his coat with the same composed ease that had defined his presence. Throughout the flight, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt smaller than it had any right to be, not because of proximity, but because of everything that had passed quietly between them, and Emily stood carefully, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, balancing her daughter securely in her arms as she stepped into the aisle, joining the slow, patient line of passengers preparing to exit, and as she moved forward, one small step at a time, she felt the familiar return of the outside world, the expectations, the responsibilities, the rhythm she knew so well, but this time, it did not feel as heavy, not because anything had changed in her circumstances, but because something within her had shifted just enough to make space for something new, something she had not expected to carry with her, and as the line moved forward, she found herself beside him for a brief moment, close enough now that the quiet acknowledgement between them could have become words, and she turned slightly, her voice soft but clear, "I just wanted to say, thank you," the words simple, unembellished, yet carrying everything she had not said before, and Daniel looked at her, not surprised, not dismissive, just present, and he gave a small nod, his voice calm, measured, "You did all the hard part," and the response landed with a quiet weight, not deflecting her gratitude, but reshaping it, placing it back where it belonged, and Emily held his gaze for a second longer, absorbing the meaning behind the words, before nodding in return, her expression softening into something that felt complete, and then the line moved again, carrying them forward in separate directions, and as Emily stepped out of the aircraft and into the terminal beyond, the noise of the world returned in full, announcements echoing, footsteps quickening, lives moving in every direction, but she did not feel lost within it, not this time, because somewhere between departure and arrival, something quiet had changed, something she would carry long after this place faded behind her, not a memory of luxury, not a story of chance, but a reminder that even in a world that often overlooked her, there were still moments where she was seen, and in those moments, everything felt just a little more possible. The terminal moved with its usual urgency, rolling suitcases echoing across polished floors, overhead announcements blending into a constant hum, people passing by with purpose, each one carrying a destination, a story, a timeline that did not pause for anyone else, and Emily Carter stepped into it all with her daughter held securely against her, her movement steady, deliberate, as she navigated through the flow without hesitation, because this was the world she knew, the pace she had learned to match, yet something about her presence felt different now, not in appearance, not in circumstance, but in the quiet way she carried herself, as if the weight she had once held so tightly had shifted just enough to give her space to breathe, and she adjusted the strap of her bag, glancing down at her daughter who now watched everything with wide, curious eyes, her small fingers curling gently against Emily's shirt, and Emily smiled softly, leaning her head just slightly toward her, whispering something quiet, something only the two of them would understand, and as she continued forward, the memory of the flight did not replay in loud fragments, it settled instead in small, steady pieces. The sound of her own voice finding comfort in different languages, the unexpected calm that followed, the quiet presence of someone who chose to act without needing to be seen, and she did not try to define it, did not try to hold on to it too tightly, because she understood now that some moments were not meant to be captured, they were meant to be carried, and behind her, further back in the terminal, Daniel Whitmore walked at a measured pace, his posture unchanged, his presence blending seamlessly into a world that recognized him in ways she never would, yet his thoughts lingered briefly on the moment that had already passed, not in a way that interrupted his path, but in a way that stayed just beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement of something that had required no strategy, no calculation, only awareness, and he did not turn to look for her, did not attempt to follow what had already reached its natural end, because he understood that its value had been in its timing, not its continuation, and Emily, unaware of the direction he had taken, stepped through the exit doors and into the morning light, the air cooler, sharper, filled with the beginning of another day, and she paused for just a second, adjusting her hold, grounding herself in the present before moving forward again, and as she did, there was no grand realization, no sudden transformation, just a quiet, steady shift in the way she saw the world around her, a recognition that even in the most ordinary, difficult spaces, there were still moments where kindness appeared without demand, without condition, and those moments, though small, had the power to change more than just a single journey, they changed the way a person moved through everything that followed, and as Emily walked forward into the rhythm of her life, that quiet truth stayed with her, not as a memory of someone she might never see again, but as something deeper, something that would shape the way she spoke, the way she endured, the way she chose to see others, because sometimes, the most powerful changes did not come from what was given, but from what was reminded, that even in a world that often felt heavy, there was still room for gentleness, and sometimes, that was enough to carry everything else.